It is 2:58 in the morning on the 17th of October, 2023, and Cliff Weston is sitting at the kitchen table of his ranger residence in Lee County, Virginia, unable to sleep. His service radio is charging on the counter. His phone is face up on the table beside his coffee mug. At 2:58, the phone buzzes, which means one of the Tacticam cameras has triggered. The screen shows a Camera 4 notification, the one mounted on the oak at the edge of the limestone glade, 200 yards north of the house. Opening the app, he waits. The image loads in 4 seconds, uploading from the cellular relay on the ridge. When it resolves on the screen, what he sees in the infrared frame is the camp. The lean-to is there. A fire ring sits in the center, and on the bench, a shape that barely fits within the camera's field of view is sitting, motionless, facing in his direction. He is sitting at that same window, right now. He does not go outside. The radio comes off the counter, and he sits in the dark kitchen holding it until the sky goes gray. My name is Cliff Weston. I am 57 years old, and I have been a ranger with the United States Forest Service since 1995, a span of 29 years that took me from my first posting at the Nez Perce National Forest in northern Idaho, all the way east to the Clinch Ranger District in the far southwestern corner of Virginia. In between those two postings, I spent 8 years at the Tombigbee National Forest in Mississippi, which taught me that the Appalachian hardwoods I grew up hiking in Ohio looked nothing like the loblolly pine country of the Deep South, and which also taught me that remote federal land carries its own particular quietness, regardless of what latitude you are standing in. There is a specific quality of stillness that comes with isolated government property. A remove from the outside world I have generally found productive for the methodical observational work that forest management requires. My career has been built on learning to read what the land tells you if you give it enough time and enough attention. That work went well for 29 years. Whether it still does is something I am less certain of now. The transfer to the Clinch Ranger District of the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests happened in August 2022. The Clinch District is the southwesternmost unit of that combined national forest, covering portions of Lee, Scott, Wise, and Dickinson counties in Virginia, and portions of adjacent Kentucky, pressing up against the state line in country that the highway maps show as a dense maze of ridgelines and hollows. Norton, in neighboring Wise County, about 45 minutes northeast along US 58, is where the district office sits. Older Appalachian geology defines the landscape. Ridges of sandstone and shale, limestone shelves breaking through the forest floor on the south-facing slopes, creek drainages that flood hard in March and run nearly dry by August. I had worked in Idaho's volcanic plateau country and Mississippi's coastal plain, and Virginia's far southwest felt like a third entirely different ecosystem. The trees were familiar to me from childhood: tulip poplar, red maple, white oak, eastern hemlock along the creek bottoms, but the topography had a compressed, layered quality that Idaho's open ridgelines never had. You learned quickly in Lee County that visibility in the forest was measured in dozens of feet, not hundreds. The terrain folded in on itself, ridge behind ridge, and what felt like a short distance on a map could take an hour to cover on foot through the understory. We arrived, Carol and I, in the first week of August, 2022. Carol is 53. A retired school administrator who had followed me through Idaho and Mississippi with a patience I have never fully understood how to repay. She spent her first 2 months in Jonesville, learning the county roads and the names of the people at the hardware store, which is how she has approached every new posting, and by October she knew more about Lee County history than I did. We are a compatible pair in that particular way. She absorbs places through people, and I absorb them through geography. Between the two of us, we usually arrive at a reasonably complete picture within a year. The USFS government residence assigned to my position was about 4 miles from the district office, located off a gravel access road that branched east from the state highway near Rose Hill. Rose Hill is a small community at the intersection of a few roads in the northern part of Lee County, and the drive from Jonesville took about 12 minutes in good conditions. The access road climbed for 1.5 miles before leveling onto a forested bench where the residents sat. It was a 2-bedroom wood frame house built in the early 1960s, when the Forest Service was expanding its presence in the Clinch District and needed housing for staff who would otherwise face an untenable commute into the backcountry. The exterior was white clapboard gone gray over decades of mountain winters, and the interior had been updated enough to be functional without ever being particularly comfortable. There was a propane furnace, a water heater, a small laundry room added as an attachment in the 1980s. The kitchen faced north, and its single large window looked out across the yard toward the tree line, where the property boundary met the national forest land. Cell service at the house required standing at the north end of the kitchen with a phone held at head height. This is not unusual for the Clinch District. The nearest cell tower was in Rose Hill, and the ridge behind the property blocked most of the signal before it reached the structure. The Forest Service had installed a signal booster on a utility pole at the high point of the access road, which gave us 1 bar of voice service in the kitchen and allowed text messages to send with patience. Data was essentially useless at the house itself, which Carol adapted to within a few weeks, and which I had already lived with in various forms at most of my prior postings. Government residences on federal forest land are not built with amenities in mind. They are built with access in mind, and access is what the Clinch District assignment required. The property itself extended roughly 4 acres around the house before the boundary markers indicated national forest land. 4 acres is not large, but the forested edge along the north and west created a natural buffer that made the property feel more isolated than its actual footprint would suggest. To the north, following the gentle slope up from the yard, about 200 yards of mixed forest led to a feature I noticed during my first week of walking the property. It was a limestone glade, a roughly oval clearing where the rock shelf pushed through the surface, topped with a thin covering of moss and sedge grasses, and ringed by red cedar and scrub oak at its edges. Limestone glades of this type are scattered through the Clinch District's topography, particularly on south-facing slopes where the carbonate bedrock sits close to the surface. They create microhabitats that differ from the surrounding forest in ways I found professionally interesting from a wildlife management standpoint. The ground surface in a glade holds moisture differently than soil. Animal movement patterns shift at the glade edge. The open exposure can attract species that avoid dense canopy. The glade, 200 yards from the house, was roughly 60 feet long and 40 feet wide at its widest point, oriented slightly east to west, with a small seep emerging at the northwest corner where water worked through a joint in the limestone and fed a trickle that ran off the shelf edge before disappearing into the forest soil. Red cedar grew densely at the north and east margins, keeping their root systems in the thin mineral soil at the rock's edge. The south margin opened more gradually into the mixed hardwood forest, with a natural path formed by the break in vegetation that deer and turkey had been using long before I arrived. In dry summer months, the glade surface held nothing, flat gray limestone with patches of moss and a few clumps of little bluestem grass in the shallow soil pockets between the rock layers. After a rain, it held water in the low spots for a day or two, before draining through the rock's natural fractures. I had documented glades across several properties in Lee County during my first year at the district, and the one 200 yards from my kitchen window went into my notes as a feature I intended to survey properly once I had the time. I set up the trail cameras in August of 2023. The purpose was a structured white-tailed deer movement survey that the Clinch District was conducting in collaboration with the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. The DWR had been tracking deer population changes in Lee County for several years, and the district was contributing camera data from 7 government properties in the county to build a broader movement picture for the autumn rut period. Our cameras were Tacticam Reveal LTE units, which transmit images via cellular data directly to a phone application, rather than storing them on an SD card for physical collection. A data plan through each camera's built-in modem was required, and in areas with adequate signal, the system allows you to review images from your phone without returning to the camera's location. In the Clinch District, signal coverage varies considerably. At the house, as I have described, coverage was marginal, but on the property's high points and at the glade itself, the cellular relay on the pole at the access road entrance provided workable signal for data transmission. The cameras typically sent images within a few minutes of triggering, though in periods of heavy traffic they could queue and transmit in batches. I deployed 6 cameras across the property and the adjacent national forest edge, positioning them at known deer corridors, scrape sites, and transition zones between forest types. Camera 1 went up along the south fence line at a well-used crossing point. Camera 2 covered the creek bottom at the east end of the property, where a game trail ran parallel to the water before rising to the bench where the house sat. Position 3 went to the old logging road at the west boundary, where I had found track sets earlier that summer. The ridgeline behind the house received Camera 5, pointed south along the slope. Along the West National Forest boundary edge, Camera 6 covered the main deer trail, running north-south. Camera 4 went up at the glade. I selected a red oak at the glade's south rim, about 8 feet up the trunk, angled north across the glade's open surface, toward the seep at the far end. The field of view covered the majority of the glade from that height, roughly 60 by 40 feet of exposed limestone shelf, with the cedar and scrub at the north edge visible at the far distance. From Camera 4's mount position, looking back over the camera toward the south, through the forest, the residence's roof and north-facing kitchen window were visible on clear days as a pale rectangle through the tree trunks. The camera was pointed away from the house, scanning the glade itself, but the geometry of the placement put the house in a rough alignment behind it. I noted that in my setup log without particular significance, it was simply where the deer were most likely to cross. I drove to the forest supervisor's office in Roanoke on September 11 for a 3-day training session covering the agency's updated interagency fire protocols and revised law enforcement coordination procedures. Roanoke is roughly 3 hours from Jonesville, and the training required me to stay over for 2 nights, which meant Carol had the house to herself from September 11 through the evening of September 13. Carol kept her own routine during training absences: a long walk in the morning, time at the Jonesville Library in the afternoon, occasionally dinner with a neighbor at the restaurant on Main Street. Remote forest residences held no particular alarm for her after our years together in similar postings. Down the access road she went for her errands, and the house sat empty most of each day, with its camera monitoring running. The evening of September 13, around 8, I arrived home and found dinner Carol had left on the stove. Sleep came early that night. The following morning was when I opened the Tacticam app to review what the cameras had picked up over those 3 days. Camera 1 had 34 triggers, mostly deer, 2 raccoons, what appeared to be a coyote at 4:17 a.m. on September 12. Position 2 had 18 triggers, primarily deer in the creek bottom during morning hours. 9 triggers over 3 days came from Camera 3, which was low for that corridor. Camera 5 returned 22. The west boundary camera, position 6, showed 41, which seemed high until I scrolled through and found a group of 7 does moving repeatedly through the same corridor over 2 consecutive evenings. Camera 4 had 51 triggers. That number paused me. In the 12 months I had been running cameras on the property the previous year, Camera 4 at the glade had averaged between 8 and 15 triggers during a comparable 3-day period in September, almost entirely deer and small mammals working the edges of the limestone shelf. 51 triggers in 3 days was more than 3 times the expected rate. I pulled up the images in sequence. The first 22 were consistent with the glade's normal activity. 2 different bucks, a group of does on the afternoon of September 12, a raccoon at the north seep on the evening of the same day, a tom turkey moving across the south end of the shelf in the morning of September 13. All of it was expected. 23 was where the picture changed. Timestamp, September 13, 11:47 p.m. Infrared showed the glade, the flat limestone surface white-gray in the camera's night illumination, the cedar fringe dark at the edges. In the middle of the glade, roughly 40 feet from the camera, there were objects that had not been there before. A ring of flat stones had been arranged in a rough circle, approximately 3 feet across. Adjacent to it, and set back about 4 feet, a section of downed tree trunk had been positioned upright on the rock surface. A log bench of sorts, the trunk running parallel to the glade's long axis, propped at the ends with smaller stones to keep it from rolling. On the south side of the glade, a few feet from where the cedar began, a lean-to structure had been erected against a standing dead tree, with a dozen branches leaned at a steep angle against the trunk, their ends braced on the ground, with secondary branches woven between them in rough horizontal layers. The opening of the lean-to faced northwest, in the direction of the residence's kitchen window 200 yards away, the same direction the log bench was set to face. The fire ring also sat between the bench and the lean-to, its orientation incidental, but its placement joining the two into a rough triangle. Everything in the triangle, if you drew a line from its center, aimed northwest toward the house. I went through the remaining images in sequence. From image 23 onward, through midnight and into the early hours of September 14, the camera triggered on the structures repeatedly. No wind was moving through the glade. The trees at the rim were still in each image. Something was triggering the passive infrared sensor, which responds to heat differential crossing the camera's detection zone. The objects themselves would not do that unless they were warm-blooded, but nothing appeared in any of the images. Whatever had moved through the detection zone was not in the frame when the shutter fired. By September 14 at 3 a.m., the camera had stopped triggering, and the dawn images showed the glade empty except for the structures, which sat exactly where they had been in the first image. My first instinct, held for about 45 seconds, was that it was an illegal camp. This is not unheard of on district properties. The National Forest land receives its share of visitors who bypass the permit process, particularly in the autumn before hunting season opens, and the access road to the residence was not gated. A hiker or off-season camper could have walked in from the highway, followed the game trail north through the property, found the limestone glade, and set up an overnight camp. The bench and lean-to were crude, but they were functional structures. The fire ring was a standard campfire setup. People camp in the National Forest without permits far more frequently than the district staff ever documents. What stopped that interpretation was the orientation. I looked at the image on my phone and I tilted it to get the glade's geometry clear in my head. The bench was set facing northwest. The open face of the lean-to was pointed northwest. Northwest from the glade was the residence, 200 yards through the trees. This was not a fire ring arranged for wind protection or warmth or cooking convenience. The normal reason you position camp furniture is to face the fire, or to face a view, or to face away from the prevailing wind. Here the fire ring was between the bench and the lean-to, neither of which were angled to face it. They were angled to face northwest. Any person sitting on that bench on the night of September 13 was sitting facing the direction of this house. Ed Farley was the law enforcement officer for the Clinch District, based out of the Jonesville office, and he had been with the Forest Service long enough to have a calm, diagnostic manner that I had found useful in situations that initially seemed unusual. I sent him the images through the app and summarized what I was seeing. He called me back within 15 minutes. His assessment on the phone was the same as mine had been before the orientation detail registered. Someone camped off permit. Probably not worth more than a report and a visit to clear the structures. Then I mentioned the directional orientation. There was a pause. He said he would come out that afternoon. Before Ed arrived, at around 11 that morning, the glade was my first stop. 7 minutes at a moderate pace north from the kitchen door brought me through the tulip, poplar, and maple until the trees thinned and the shelf opened, exactly as the camera had shown it. Every structure exactly where it appeared in the images. Standing at the camera position and looking back across the glade, I could orient the angle of the bench and the lean-to opening clearly. They pointed past me, through the south tree line. Toward the roof of the house I could partially see through the branches. I walked the perimeter of the glade carefully before entering. The limestone surface holds no impressions. That is simply the nature of the rock. It is hard enough and flat enough that a person or animal crossing it does not compress soil or vegetation the way they would on a dirt path or a mossy forest floor. The grass and sedge at the glade's edges were another matter. I looked at the transition zone where soil met rock on all four sides, the places where anything approaching the glade would have to cross soft ground before stepping onto the shelf. On the north side, the soil near the seep was damp and should have shown clear tracks. It showed none. On the south side, the forest floor leading toward the game trail had a layer of fallen leaves over loose soil. It showed no impression of passage. I went around the full perimeter twice, looking carefully. There was no sign that anything with significant weight had approached or left the glade since the structures appeared. I want to be precise about this, because the absence of tracks on soft ground near a limestone outcrop is a detail that can mislead a casual observer into thinking it means nothing. The soft ground near the seep at the north end was damp enough to hold a boot print to a depth of half an inch. The forest floor on the south approach had enough fallen leaf material over loose soil that my own passage back and forth left visible disturbance that I could read from 10 feet away. These are surfaces that record passage. They had not recorded any. Whatever had assembled the structures on the glade had arrived and departed without crossing the soil margins in any way I could identify, which left me with the limestone surface itself as the only path. And limestone holds nothing. This arrangement is what the structures showed. A fire ring had been assembled from limestone pieces matching the surface material. Flat slabs stood on edge in a circle. Mechanical competence was evident in how the stones were set in contact with each other, and the circle made reasonably even. But the fire pit inside was empty and showed no signs of ever having been used. No ash, no char marks on the stone. The wood of the log bench was a section of tulip poplar trunk, maybe 8 inches in diameter and 4 feet long. Somebody had wedged smaller flat stones under each end to stabilize it on the rock surface. Along the top of the log, the bark on one side had been compressed and cracked. Wood fibers, visible through splits running the length of the section. A pattern I noticed immediately. That compressed span ran about 2 feet wide across the log's center. Sitting on a log and leaving compression marks is not unusual, but the span of that mark was wider than I would expect from any person I knew, and the depth of the cracks in the wood suggested a load that had flexed the trunk significantly. I put both hands on the top of the log and pressed down. The wood was solid. Whatever had compressed those fibers had done it with weight I could not replicate. The lean-to was made from branches that had been broken from living trees, not gathered from deadfall. I could see the break points on each branch where it had been snapped rather than cut, with the bark peeled back at the fracture in the way live wood tears when forced. The branches were thick, many of them 1.5 inches to 2 inches in diameter, and breaking them without a tool would have required either a cutting implement I saw no evidence of, or a level of manual force that would challenge most adults to apply one-handed. They were stacked with their tips at the ground and their bases leaning against the dead tree, angled steeply, and secondary branches were woven between them horizontally at roughly 1-foot intervals. The overall construction was functional in the sense that it would provide partial shelter from rain. It was not neat or expert. The branches were at irregular intervals, and the weaving was inconsistent, but it had been done with what appeared to be genuine effort. Ed Farley arrived at the glade at 2 p.m. His walk of the perimeter matched mine, followed by a crouch beside the log bench to study the compression mark without touching it, then a check of the lean-to's break points. Nothing was said for about 5 minutes. Then he said it was the strangest illegal camp he had seen in 23 years on the district. He filed a report with the district office noting an unpermitted structure on government property at the residence location, and he flagged the case for a follow-up visit from a Lee County deputy to cover any jurisdiction questions. Art Combs drove up the access road the following afternoon, September 15, a tall man with a deliberate manner who had served the county for a long time. He looked at the structures, looked at the glade perimeter with Ed and me, agreed that the access question was unclear and the physical evidence was thin, and wrote a report noting that no evidence of criminal activity had been found. He told me to call him if the situation escalated or if I saw anyone on the property. Neither he nor Ed suggested removing the structures at that point in case there was a follow-up investigation needed. The camp remained on the glade where it had appeared. I notified Carol, who had been at the library in Jonesville when I first found the images, and who received the information with the same practical equanimity she brings to most things. Walking up to see the glade was what Carol wanted, and on the morning of September 16 we did it together. At the south edge of the shelf, looking back through the tree line toward the house, she said that if someone had put the camp up to watch the residents, the positioning was well chosen. Alarm was not part of her response. Carol has a way of assessing a situation that skips past the unnerving parts to get to the logistical ones. She suggested that if whoever set the camp up came back, the cameras would show it, which was true and was the most practical observation available. We agreed to leave the cameras as positioned and to review the app more frequently. On the night of September 19 into September 20, Camera 4 triggered again. I got the notification on my phone at breakfast. The batch of images showed the glade at various points, from 11 p.m. through 2 a.m., all showing the camp structures still in place, unchanged. Then, at 12:47 a.m., a single image caught something else. At the left margin of the frame, where the red cedar fringe began at the glade's north edge, there was a shape that had not been in any previous image. It was at the edge of the infrared field, in the area of brightest exposure closest to the camera's illumination zone, and it was partially occluded by the cedar branches, but the portion visible was large, upright. The silhouette of what I could see above the cedar, a shoulder, the side of a head, a portion of an arm, reached well above the height of the cedar, which ran about 7 feet along that edge of the glade. The shape was moving when the shutter fired, which was why the camera had triggered, and it was moving away from the glade toward the north. By the next image, 30 seconds later, the frame was empty again. That image held my attention for a long time. Enlarging it on the phone until the pixels degraded told me little more than the full version. The copy went to Ed Farley, with the timestamp. He called me back, and I could hear something in his voice that had not been there on September 14. Not alarm, but a kind of careful attention. He asked if I thought it was a bear. I said the proportions did not fit. A bear moving through cedar brush at night reads differently on infrared than what I was seeing. The broad back, the distinctive gait, the way the brush reacts to a bear's movement through it. What I was seeing moved like something upright, and it moved quickly, and it was taller than the cedar by what I estimated was another foot or more. Ed said he would come back out. He came on September 21, and we went through the glade together, examined the north cedar edge again, found nothing that the limestone and rock substrate would have held. He was quieter on the second visit than the first. Before he left, he asked if I had checked the structures to see if anything had been disturbed. I had. Nothing had changed. Lean-to in place. Bench, where it had been placed. The empty fire ring between them, its stones arranged and never lit, still aimed northwest toward the residence, the same way they had been pointed since the night they appeared. I checked the September footage again the following week, after pulling up the date records to cross-reference a related deer movement query for the DWR study. I pulled up September 28. Camera 4 had triggered 11 times between 2:41 a.m. and 3:14 a.m., all in a 33-minute window. I pulled up the images in sequence and went through them one by one. The glade was occupied. The first image in the sequence, timestamp 2:41, showed the camp as it had been sitting since September 13. By the 2:46 image, something was on the bench. A shape filling most of the camera's center field at an estimated distance of about 25 feet, seated on the log bench, facing northwest. The infrared light caught it fully, broad through the torso, with a width at the shoulders that exceeded what I had ever seen in 29 years of recording wildlife on cameras. The proportions were not ursine. Its posture was upright as a seated person holds upright, weight centered over the hips, upper body above vertical, with the arms hanging forward at the sides in a position consistent with resting. But the height of the shape, even seated, cleared the top of the log bench by what appeared to be several feet. If I measured the bench height at roughly 18 inches off the ground, the seated figure's head and upper torso were rising another 4 or 5 feet above that. The shape did not move in any of the 11 images from that sequence. No movement at all across that 33-minute window. It sat on the bench and it faced northwest, toward the house, for 33 minutes before the camera stopped triggering. My records for September 28 were the next thing I opened. Home that night. In bed before 10 o'clock, which was early but not unusual for a work week. Carol had gone to bed around 11. Our bedroom window faces north, second window from the left as you look at the house from the yard. The bearing from the glade center toward the house runs through that window. The shape on that bench had been sitting 200 yards from my bedroom window while I was asleep inside. Sleep did not come again that night. The house had been dark and quiet while that shape sat on the bench, and neither of us had known it was there. In the morning, I went up to the glade before breakfast, in the early light, with a measuring tape and a notepad. The bench was where it had always been. The bench surface measured 17 inches from the ground. Noting that, I stood at the bench position, faced northwest, and sighted down the slope through the trees. The line of sight passed directly toward the residence's north wall. I then walked to the south rim of the glade and stood where camera 4 was mounted. From that position, looking back at the bench location with the forest slope dropping away behind it, I could see the roofline and upper story of the house at an angle through the tulip poplars. The bench and the house were in approximate alignment from that camera position. Someone or something sitting on the bench would have had a direct sightline through those same trees to the north wall of the residence. I went back to the bench and examined the compression marks on the log more carefully in the morning light than I had been able to on my first inspection. The bark along the top of the log had been compressed and cracked across a span I measured at roughly 26 inches, with the deepest cracking centered in the middle of that span. The wood beneath the bark was not simply surface marked. The trunk itself had been deflected, and the cracks ran longitudinally through the outer growth rings. I found a similar depression at the ground beside the bench that I had not noticed before, a circular compression in the moss and thin soil between two limestone sections. The compression was about 8 inches across and perhaps a 1/4 inch deep, this type of mark that a boot heel or a rounded base would leave if something very heavy had pressed down on it. The pattern was repeated twice, roughly 3 feet apart, roughly consistent with a standing position beside the log. I photographed everything and sent the images to Ed Farley. He called within the hour. He had been thinking about the September 19 image overnight, he said, and about the September 28 sequence. 23 years with the Forest Service gave Ed a frame of reference I respected. Illegal camps, unauthorized hunting blinds, homeless encampments on national forest land. All of these he had dealt with in various forms. Nothing in that experience matched what we were documenting. His direct question was whether I thought this was a person. I told him I did not know. He said the same. Art Combs came out for the second time on September 30. He was more thorough on this visit, walking the access road from the highway up to the residence, then going up the slope to the glade, taking photographs of his own, examining the bench compression and the soil impression I had documented. He spent about 40 minutes on the glade. When he came back down to the house, he sat in the kitchen with a coffee and said what both Ed and I were already thinking, which was that there was nothing actionable here by any law enforcement standard he could apply. No criminal damage, no threats, no trespassing that he could document because there was no evidence of how the trespassing occurred. He suggested that the camp structures be removed, which I had the authority to do as the responsible party for the residence property, and that the area be monitored. That was my stated intention, and he would hear from me if the camera documented anyone returning. The structures stayed in place. I told myself it was because the camera evidence was still being developed and I did not want to disturb the site. That was partially true. The fuller truth was that I wanted to see what the cameras would show if the camp remained intact, and removing it might change whatever behavioral pattern was producing the appearances. This was a decision that made sense from a documentation standpoint, and it is also the decision I have thought about a good deal since. October began with normal camera activity. Cameras 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 showed the expected patterns. Deer movement intensifying as the rut approached. A black bear active on the east drainage. The coyote pair from September showing up again along the west fence line. Camera 4 at the glade triggered on 2 deer moving across the shelf on October 3, 2 more on October 5, and nothing else through October 8. I reviewed each batch of images with more attention than the study protocol required, looking at every frame carefully before moving on. On October 9th, the glade triggered again at night. The batch came through in the morning. The first 3 images from that night were empty. Glade surface, camp structures, cedar fringe, nothing moving. Then at 1:33 a.m., an image with a shape at the west margin of the glade, partially behind the seep's cedar growth, but visible enough to estimate. This was the clearest capture I had yet. The infrared illumination at that distance was strong enough to outline the shape without the partial occlusion of the September 19 image. What I was looking at stood at the glade's edge, upright. My scale reference was the cedar at the glade margin, which I knew ran between 6 and 7 feet at that point. Shoulder level on the shape was above the cedar's top. Whatever term applied to the upper portion of the shape, it extended perhaps another 1.5 feet above that. I went through that image for a long time. I enlarged it until it degraded, went back to a smaller size where the edges were sharper, enlarged again. Arm to torso proportion was what held my attention. Hanging from the shoulders, the arms would put the hands well below mid-thigh on a standing figure. not a proportion consistent with any primate I had studied or documented. A bear's forelegs reach roughly to mid-chest when it stands. A human's arms reach to roughly mid-thigh. What I was looking at put the hands considerably lower than that, closer to knee level on a figure standing at full height, broad through the torso in a way that seemed inconsistent with the tapering I would expect from a bear or from a person, and the shape of the head was not consistent with either. No visible ears. The profile was nearly symmetrical in a way that ruled out the asymmetric ear placement of a large canid. I sent the image to Ed that evening. He did not call back until the next morning, and when he did, his first question was whether I had consulted with anyone from the wildlife division at the regional office. I had not yet. He suggested I do that before we took further action. I called the DWR regional wildlife biologist at the Marion office on October 11, a person I had worked with on previous surveys, and described the images without sending them first. Her initial response was bear, which was the same initial response Ed and I had both had, and for the same reasons. Bears do stand upright. Bears do move at night. Bears are present in Lee County. I sent her the October 9 image and the September 28 sequence. She called me back the following afternoon and said she could not identify what I was showing her, and that I should document it as an unidentified animal and keep the cameras running. Her tone was not dismissive. She just did not have an identification to offer. The October 17 notification at 2:58 a.m. was what I described at the beginning of this account. I had not been sleeping well since the September 28 discovery. I got up on that particular night around 1 in the morning because I could not remain in the bedroom, and I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off and the radio on the counter and my phone face up beside my coffee. The table is at the north kitchen window, and I had developed a habit that I noticed in myself without fully acknowledging, which was that I did not sit at that window after dark anymore, unless there was a light on in the kitchen. On October 17, I was sitting in the dark with the window behind me, and at 2:58 the phone buzzed with a Camera 4 notification. The image showed the camp. On the bench, a shape that filled most of the camera's infrared field at an estimated 20 feet, seated, facing the house. Completely still. I held the phone for several minutes without moving. I could hear the house making the small settling sounds it makes at night, the propane lines clicking, the floorboards adjusting in the temperature change of the small hours. Looking out the window was not what I did. My outdoor work across 3 decades has included black bears in camp and coyotes within a few feet of where I was standing, and none of those encounters had frozen me. Sitting at that kitchen table in the dark did. Whatever the image showed on that screen was different from an animal encounter in a way I cannot fully describe. I sat very still and I held the radio and I did not look out the north window. And at a certain point, the coffee went cold, and the sky began to lighten, and I was still sitting in the same position. Carol came downstairs at 6 and found me there, and I showed her the image, and she was quiet for a moment, and then asked if I had slept at all. I had not. I want to be precise about what changed after October 17, because the change was real and it affected how I worked and lived in the residence for the remaining months I was there, and I think it is worth documenting rather than glossing over. Anxiety in the ordinary sense is not part of my character. 30 years in remote landscapes builds a particular kind of operational steadiness that I had always relied on and mostly taken for granted. After October 17, that steadiness had a gap in it, specifically related to the north window and the slope toward the glade. During daylight hours, I went about the district work normally. I drove my routes. I attended district meetings in Jonesville. I met with Ed Farley to go over the camera data. The work was not affected. What was affected was the space between 8 in the evening and dawn, in the residence, on the side of the house that faced north. The kitchen table moved away from the north window in the 3rd week of October. Carol was told it was rearranging for better light, which was not true, and which she did not believe, but did not challenge. An additional set of curtains went over the bedroom window above the headboard, with an additional set of curtains that Carol ordered from a hardware store catalog. The existing curtains were adequate by any normal standard. The additional curtain made the room darker in the morning, which was inconvenient, and it made me feel marginally better about sleeping directly below that window, which was the point. Carol did not comment on the curtains. She mentioned once, in mid-November, that she had been thinking about the Hoosier National Forest posting that had come up in the district rotation the previous year, a position similar to mine but in Indiana, and she asked if I had given it any thought. I said I had not. She said she was just mentioning it. I contacted Dr. Lou Hensley at Radford University the following week. Ed Farley had suggested it. He had been reading about the history of the Clinch District as part of his own attempt to understand what we were dealing with, and he had come across a reference to a study of pre-colonial landscape use in the Clinch River drainage that cited a Radford University historian. Dr. Hensley's department was listed as Appalachian and Indigenous history. I sent her an email summarizing the situation and attaching the most significant camera images, and she responded within 2 days, asking if she could speak by phone. She called from her office on October 25. I had not expected her to take the inquiry particularly seriously. I was aware that my description of the situation sounded, stripped of its specifics, like something a person might dismiss quickly. Dismissal was not her response. Looking at the images carefully, she said, had given her a context she wanted to share, without claiming it was an explanation. Limestone glades in the Clinch River Valley had been documented in 18th and 19th century survey records as sites of what she described as territorial marking in indigenous practice. Cherokee communities who inhabited the Clinch drainage before European settlement and who were forced out of the region during the late 18th century identified certain landscape features as liminal boundaries, places where the boundary between human territory and something older or larger was permeable. Limestone glades, she continued, appear in several period documents as sites where unusual behavior was reported by indigenous observers, consistent with what she described as a watching pattern, not aggressive, not communicative, simply present at a threshold. Her care was in describing historical documentation without endorsing any particular interpretation. The structures I was describing, fire ring, bench arrangement, shelter opening facing inward toward human habitation, bore a resemblance to what ethnographers had recorded in accounts from the region's indigenous residents about how a certain class of territorial entities indicated presence, not through attack or sound, but through the imitation of human structure. She said the imitation was always approximate, never exact. Fire rings that were never lit, seating that faced inward rather than toward the fire, shelters with their openings oriented toward human activity rather than sheltering against weather. I asked her if she had a word or category for what she was describing. She said the historical records used several terms in translation, and that none of them mapped cleanly onto either modern ecological categories or popular cultural concepts. She said the clearest sense she had from the documented accounts was that these were entities associated with specific landscape features, limestone outcrops in this region, and that they were drawn to the boundaries between their territory and human activity rather than into the interior of either. They watched. That was the consistent behavior across the accounts she had studied. They constructed visible indicators of presence near human habitation, and they remained at a distance, and the watching continued until either the human party withdrew or until some other change occurred that she could not define from the historical record. She said she did not have a scientific explanation for what my cameras were showing, and she was not going to pretend she did. She said she found it significant that I had not found footprints. The historical accounts also mentioned the absence of tracks in every case she had read. I thanked her and stayed on the phone with her for another 20 minutes, asking questions about the specific area of Lee County and the documented history of the Clinch drainage. She had researched the glade locations in the county as part of a survey of pre-colonial landscape use, and she said the glade 200 yards from the residence was on a ridge that formed a documented territorial boundary in the Cherokee Land Organization of the region, referenced in a 1790 survey as a place where the boundary between the cleared agricultural land of the Clinch Valley settlers and the interior hunting territory was marked by what the surveyor described as a stacked stone, arrangement he did not understand and did not attribute to the European settlers. She said she did not know if the stone arrangement the surveyor described and my fire ring were related, but the location matched. I asked her about the behavior pattern she had described, the imitation of human structure, and whether the historical accounts ever noted escalation. She said the accounts she had access to were inconsistent on that point. In some cases, the watching behavior continued for seasons without change. In others, it stopped abruptly and was not documented again at that location. She said she had not found an account that described an escalation to direct confrontation, and she was careful to note that the historical record was fragmentary and filtered through the perspectives of people who did not necessarily understand what they were observing. Across all the accounts, the most consistent element was the lack of aggression, combined with deliberate proximity. The entities got closer over time in the cases where the behavior escalated, but the closest documented approach remained outside any threshold the human party described as an attack. She asked me if I wanted her to come and look at the site. My response was that I would let her know. That has not happened. Thinking about why, and the clearest answer I have is that having a researcher examine the glade would have required me to articulate what I believed was happening there, and at no point during the months I lived with this situation was I able to construct a coherent belief about what was happening there. There were images. Physical evidence in the form of compression marks and the soil impression was documented. A historical context from Dr. Hensley that did not constitute an explanation but did constitute a precedent of a kind. What I did not have, and still do not have, is any framework for understanding an entity of the size and behavior the cameras documented. I am a wildlife professional. My training is in population dynamics, habitat assessment, species identification, and resource management. None of that training gave me a category for what Camera 4 was showing, and the absence of a category made me reluctant to invite additional observation that might produce more evidence I could not categorize. November brought colder weather and more frequent camera activity throughout the property. The deer movement survey was producing good data. Camera 4 triggered on the glade more in October and November than it had in September, and not all of it was the entity. Deer used the limestone shelf as a crossing point during the early rut, which was consistent with what I had seen in prior years. But the entity continued to appear. I documented it on Camera 4 on October 29, November 4, November 11, and November 16. By the November captures, the lean-to had been modified. Additional branches had been woven into the structure, filling gaps and extending the shelter's coverage. The work was crude in the same way the original construction had been crude, trial and error rather than technique, but it represented effort expended over multiple visits. Something was returning to the camp and working on it. The bench had also been attended to. The split wood at the center of the log had been repositioned, the cracked sections pushed back together, and a flat stone placed on top, apparently wedging the wood closed. It had not held well, but the attempt was visible. I noticed two other changes in the November images that I had not observed before. The fire ring, which had never shown any sign of use, now had a different arrangement of stones at its south edge. 3 of the original stones had been moved and replaced with larger flat pieces brought from elsewhere on the glade's surface, extending the ring's diameter on that side by about 8 inches. It was not a functional improvement. A fire ring does not need to be asymmetric to work, but it was a deliberate modification. The second change was harder to describe. The lean-to's opening, which had faced roughly northwest since the structure first appeared, had been incrementally rotated. In the September images, the lean-to faced directly toward the line of the house. In November, the facing was perhaps 15 degrees more northerly. The total change was small, but it was consistent across 3 camera captures and represented a deliberate adjustment of the structure's angle. I measured the facing angle from the November 11 image against the September 14 image and found that the rotation corresponded closely with the bearing from the glade to the bedroom window specifically, rather than to the center of the house. The bedroom window. The north-facing window above the headboard where I had slept for 14 months. Someone or something had adjusted the lean-to to face that particular window more precisely than the original construction had managed. The November 16 capture was the one that changed my relationship to the cameras in a way I am still processing. The batch came through at 4 a.m. Awake already. Shorter intervals and pre-dawn waking had become routine since October, and forcing sleep back was no longer something I tried. Away from the north window in the living room, I waited. When the notification came, the app opened, and the images came through in sequence. First 4 showed the glade at 2:58, 3:06, 3:21, and 3:38, with the entity on the bench in each, seated and facing northwest, as it had been in every previous nighttime sequence. Then the 351 image showed the glade empty. Bench vacant, lean-to unchanged, fire ring undisturbed between them. At 3:55, the entity was at the camera. It had crossed the glade in the 4-minute gap between images and was standing within what I estimated, from the size of the frame relative to what I knew of the camera's field of view, was 4 or 5 feet from the lens. The camera is mounted at 6 feet on the trunk. The entity was not standing at full height. The upper body was angled forward, the head lowered, in a position that would have put its face at approximately camera level at that distance. Infrared at 4 feet was at maximum brightness, overexposed at center and shading to normal at the edges. What the image showed in the face region was oriented directly into the lens. 2 areas of brighter reflection in the upper center, whatever they were, sat wider set than any reference point I could apply to them. Proportionally, the head was smaller than the torso, by a ratio that looked wrong regardless of the angle from which I studied it. One frame held that image. 30 seconds later, the glade was empty again. I sat with that image for a long time. I turned the phone face down eventually and sat in the dark living room listening to the house and the forest outside it. At some point, Carol came downstairs and sat beside me without speaking, and I showed her the November 16 image without saying anything, looking at it without speaking. The phone went down on the cushion between us, and after a moment she asked how close the camera was to the house. I told her 200 yards. She said that was not very far. I said no, it was not. We sat together until it was light enough to see the yard from the living room window, and neither of us looked at the north side of the house. I called Ed Farley at 7 that morning. Ed drove out from Jonesville and arrived by 8:30. Looked at the November 16 image on my phone for a long time without speaking, then asked me to send it to his phone. The enlargement came next, studied from different angles. What he asked was what I thought had happened in the 4-minute gap between the 3:51 image showing the bench empty and the 3:55 image showing the entity at the camera. I said I thought it had walked from the bench to the camera in those 4 minutes. The glade is about 60 feet long. 4 minutes is more than enough time to cross 60 feet at almost any pace. He asked if I thought it was aware that there was a camera on the tree. I told him that the November 16 image suggested it was. An entity that approaches a camera at night and positions its face in front of the lens at camera height is either aware of the camera or exhibits behavior indistinguishable from awareness. Ed looked at the image one more time, and then he put his phone in his pocket, and he asked me a question that I think deserved more of a direct answer than I gave it. He asked if I was planning to stay at the residence through the winter. I said I had not made a decision. He did not say anything to that. He drove back to Jonesville, and I did not see him again until December. Carol and I talked that night for a long time. It was the first extended conversation we had had specifically about whether to leave the posting early, and it covered more than just the camera images. It covered the months of disrupted sleep, the curtains, the rearranged table, the way I walked around the interior of the house without going near the north wall after dark, the way I had been reviewing the camera app every morning the instant I woke up before doing anything else. Carol is methodical in her thinking, and she laid these things out not as complaints but as inventory. She was describing what she had been observing in me for 2 months. She asked if I thought we were in any danger. I told her honestly that nothing in the documentation suggested the entity had any interest in entering the house or approaching the house directly. Everything it had done, from the initial camp setup through the November 16 approach to the camera, occurred on the glade or at the glade's margin, 200 yards away. She said 200 yards was a distance a person could cover in 3 minutes at a walk. I said yes. She said she trusted my assessment and that whatever I decided she would go with, but that she wanted me to understand she was not attached to remaining at this particular posting. I said I understood. We went to bed and I did not sleep well, but I slept, which was more than I had managed on most nights since October. I did not go to the glade again after November 16. I monitored camera 4 through the app from the kitchen. The entity appeared twice more in late November, on the 22nd and the 28th, both times on the bench, in the earlier night pattern. By mid-December, the camera had not triggered on the entity for 3 weeks. By late December, 4 weeks without an appearance. I reviewed the glade images from December carefully and found nothing unusual. Deer, a red fox that was new to the camera record, a turkey hen on a warm afternoon in the third week of the month. The camp structures remained where they had been since September. Fire ring, bench, lean-to, all of it still in place, the lean-to already beginning to settle and lose shape in the December wind and the first ice. I submitted a transfer request to the Forest Service Regional Office in Atlanta on the 7th of February 2024. The stated reason was family circumstances, which the agency processes without requiring elaboration. There were family circumstances at play. Carol had been offered a consulting position with a school system in central Indiana that she wanted to take seriously, and I was not unwilling to leave the Clinch District. The transfer was approved in March. We were assigned to the Hoosier National Forest in Orange County, Indiana, a posting I had never considered but which I accepted without negotiation. We loaded our belongings from the government residence in late April and drove north. Before we left, I walked up to the glade one final time in early April. The camp was there. The fire ring, the bench, the lean-to. I stood at the south rim of the shelf and looked across the limestone and the structures and the cedar fringe, and I listened to the creek and the birds and the wind in the hardwoods, and then I walked back down to the house and finished the packing. I told the district office that the glade structure was an illegal camp that had never been fully cleared, and that the incoming occupant of the residence should be notified. That went in as a maintenance note. Nothing about the camera images made it into any formal report. There is no category on any form I know of for what the camera images showed. Ed Farley has copies of the significant images. Art Combs has a copy of the October 9 capture. Dr. Hensley at Radford University has the images I sent her, and she has used them in a paper she is writing about pre-colonial landscape documentation in the Clinch drainage, in a section about anomalous behavioral patterns that she frames carefully within the limits of what the historical record can support. The cameras themselves were returned to the district equipment pool when I left. We have been in Indiana for several months now. The Hoosier National Forest is a different landscape from the Clinch District in almost every way that landscape can differ. Flat second-growth hardwoods where Virginia had steep ridge and hollow, corn and soybean fields visible at the forest edge where Virginia had unbroken national forest land for miles. I still run trail cameras on the study plots I manage here, a different protocol from the DWR deer survey, but the same basic workflow of checking images, cataloging species, logging timestamps, and behavioral notes. I review those images each morning, which is when I have always reviewed trail camera images before the Clinch District changed that habit. The study plots here are in open second-growth timber stands with good sightlines. The cameras trigger on whitetails, red fox, and the occasional coyote. Nothing that raises questions I cannot answer. Night review of trail camera images is not something I do anymore. Face down on the kitchen table after dark is where the phone stays, and no north-facing window has seen me sitting at it since I left Lee County. That limestone glade is still there, 200 yards north of the government residence east of Rose Hill. A new ranger has the posting now. I do not know whether the camp structures are still standing, or whether anyone removed them, or whether camera 4 is still running. I have considered reaching out to Ed to ask, and each time I have decided not to. What the camera showed on September 28 for 33 minutes, and on November 16 at 3:55, and on October 17 when I watched the image load at the kitchen table, those records exist and are clear. An explanation for any of it is not something I have arrived at. What I have is the record. The images are on my phone and they will stay there, and they are what they are, and I do not have a better answer for them than I had on the first morning. I opened the app and saw a camp on the glade that faced my window.